What does Bloomingdale's, stenographers, tennis, and Foghorn Leghorn have in common? Quelle surprise! Another episode of the Gilded Age. Hey everyone, this is D, Movie Man, fellow cinephile, popcorn addict, and emerging film critic, coming to you with reliable recaps, reviews, and reactions. And today, of course, I'm coming to you all with another episode of the Gilded Age, Season 1, Episode 8, Tucked Up in Newport. This episode was directed by Michael Engler and written by Julian. We open up this episode with George, who is still very much in dire straits with the whole train derailment situation and legal case. He's looking for some kind of breakthrough with Mr. Clay and his legal team, but they have come up with absolutely nothing. At the Russells, we see that the plans for Gladys's debut have ramped up considerably. Additionally, we find out that Bertha and Gladys will be spending 10 days in Newport. And apparently so will Oscar. We see him sitting down with his side piece, John. Oscar has realized that Larry and Gladys will be in Newport the same time as him. John's sodium levels are rising per usual, because he figured this whole Gladys situation was over and done with. But no, Oscar sees his chance, and Gladys is the endgame once more. John makes it very clear to Oscar that he loves him. Oscar flinches at that because he's like, we are in a room full of people. We are very much in public. So ixnay on the love confessions. I flinched for a very different reason. And that's because I realized that John is very much into Oscar, but Oscar is just not that into him. I think Oscar is with John just for the sake of convenience. Oscar needs more money, and he also has to fend off gossip about a man his age with no marriage prospects. So, Newport it is. And speaking of Newport, Agnes is very unclear as to why everyone is headed there. She says, what happened to Saratoga Springs? It was all the rage when I was a bride. Ada says, exactly. We discover that Aurora is also headed to Newport to stay with Mr. McAllister. Ada says, surely you're not going alone with Mr. McAllister. And Aurora says, well, I'd be safe as Brandy if I were. Which is a very clear shot at Mr. McAllister's personal proclivities, shall we say? But there are more pressing matters. Aurora informs Marion of her worries about Tom, especially given what happened at the lighting ceremony. But surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, Marion just shrugs it off. And speaking of Tom, he arrives in the staff entrance to speak to Peggy. Bridget informs him that she's currently upstairs in her room, and Tom asks Bridget to give her a letter. And naturally, Armstrong, of all people, makes it her business to deliver the letter to Peggy herself. As soon as I saw that, I was just like... In other news, Marion is certain that she wants to elope with Tom, despite the obvious red flags. She feels like the only way to silence all the doubters is to just get married and be done with it. And I was just thinking that is a very youthful way to look at things. I understand following your heart. I understand love conquers all. But a lot of times there is a greater reality in life that trumps that. And unfortunately, that is a lesson that Marion is going to have to learn. Now, hopefully, she can learn that lesson without having to make a really big mistake. But this is Marion we're talking about, so that may be unlikely. Finally, Armstrong delivers the letter to Peggy with a smile on her face. And once again, as soon as I saw that, I already knew what time it was. And so does Peggy. She is perceptive enough to know that Armstrong has opened her letter, not to mention the slick comment about keeping secrets. We see Bannister visit Church and Mrs. Bruce as they oversee Bertha and Gladys's departure to Newport. He also references the fact that Turner has left and that she must not be a great friend to Church, given what she wrote Bannister. And of course, Church is very curious as to what she might have said, but Bannister makes it clear that there is nothing for them to worry about. At least, not today. Uh-oh. They also notice Monsieur Baudin arguing with a young woman in the street. And in an interesting development with yet another of the Russell staff, we see Watson back at Mrs. McNeil's. However, Mrs. McNeil is very aware that he's been there before, which is not a surprise because he wasn't exactly hiding in plain sight. She speaks with him, and it's very clear that Watson knows her, but that she doesn't know him. Well, that is until he reveals his name to be Collier, and he calls her Flora. And she has a very strong visceral reaction to his name, and she simply turns around and heads into the house. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is the story there? I need to know. Once again, more foolishness with Tom and Marion. They realize that there's no use in delaying the inevitable. We can move on. We also see Marion and Ada at Bloomingdale's. I actually neglected to mention that this is the name of the store that we saw back in episode 4, where Marion had that run-in with Mrs. Chamberlain, and Peggy had her own run-in with some very ignorant staff. But yes, the store is none other than Bloomingdale's. It was created by Joseph B. Bloomingdale and Lyman G. Bloomingdale in 1861. And 161 years later, it is still in operation. As she enters the store, Marion recognizes George's stenographer because Larry pointed her out when she was seeing both him and Oscar off to Newport. But she rushes past her before Marion can say anything. And before Marion can purchase something, the store clerk realizes that the woman, named Mrs. Dixon, has left her purse behind. Marion lets her know that she can return the purse to her since she knows where to find her. But as soon as I heard the name Dixon, I was like... And my suspicions were confirmed when Marion returns the purse to Church, and he's confused by the name that she gives. And so is George when he arrives. Marion mentions that it belongs to his stenographer. He says, "Do you mean Miss Ainsley?" And Marion mentions that the name said in Bloomingdale's was Miss Dixon. Oh, and you should have seen my face when I put it all together. I was like, It is about to go down. While paying her debt back to Ada, Mrs. Bower lets both Marion and Ada know that she believes Armstrong is planning to do Peggy a disservice. And at long last, Peggy figures it's time to tell her story. And it's not that far away from what many of us have guessed. When Peggy said that Elias changed her life, it's because she became his wife and the mother of their child. However, she ended up losing the child in childbirth. And since her father was not having it, he bullied Elias into saying that he was married before and got a judge to declare the marriage void. She was told to forget it ever happened, and there it is. Peggy then attempted to venture out and locate the midwife, particularly in Doylestown, but she couldn't find her there. So once she made her way to the railway station, she bumped into a young woman who was in need of a train ticket. And here we are today, which also explains why she was in need of Tom's services. Marion is understandably sad and hurt for Peggy, but she also makes it clear that Agnes has to hear this from Peggy's own lips. We then jump forward to the bright, sunny, and breezy city of Newport. We see everyone gathered together at the casino. Some are playing tennis, while others are gathered together to spectate and gossip. I must say, I love how casual everyone is in this setting. Honestly, this is as close as you probably got to casual in those times. The straw hats, the light colors, probably somewhat less heavy clothing in general, so I thought that was pretty interesting. We also see Mrs. Fish, and she is in rare form. In fact, she's so bold as to ask Bertha about her husband's legal matters. But Bertha just shrugs it off. Nope, everything's all good. He just has way too many meetings to be able to join us. You can see the obvious skepticism in Mrs. Fish's face, but she decides to move on. Later, after the tennis match, we see everyone gathered together, and who should arrive but John? I am not going to lie. When he walked up and I saw Oscar's face, I said, whoo! I was done. John mentions that he'll be staying with the Wetmores at Chateau Sumer. And Mrs. Fish figures it would be a great idea to invite Mr. McAllister, John, and the new people to dinner. Especially John, because she likes the cut of his jib. Clearly, Oscar is not pleased by this, but too bad, so sad. We fast forward to George's trial, where an important detail has been revealed regarding the case. And that would be none other than Miss Ainsley, who was called to the stand. She is asked if she's familiar with anyone else in the courtroom. She says no. Then Mr. Dixon is asked to stand, and she's asked the question again. Once again, no. But then they bring up Bloomingdale, suggesting that the two of them were there together, and then Miss Ainsley slips up and says that, well, I used the charge account, but we weren't there together. Shut up! We suddenly hear from Dixon. Well, I believe someone has just given the entire game away. We find out that she knew personally what Dixon was up to, and she purposely kept those written notes in case they might end up being useful. This is not even the first time that Dixon has appropriated money, and as far as the note, it had nothing to do with the train. It was actually for decoration and renovations of his office. Regardless of the details, George has been exonerated and his reputation restored. All's well that ends well, right? Not quite. George is uncertain whether Miss Ainsley will go to jail or not, but he has his own plans for her. Anytime she attempts to apply for a job above the rank of the most menial servant, he will simply inform her superiors of her past history, making it impossible for them to employ her. She might scrub floors to earn her bread, but nothing more. Whew! Well, hell hath no fury like a George Russell scorned. So throughout the episode, we see Bridget taking an interest in what Jack is doing. He has these flowers, but he's not saying who they're for. He's not saying what he has going on and what he's up to. So Bridget figures, let me follow him and see what's going on. Naturally, she assumes that he's found a new girl. But in the end, she ends up pretty much embarrassing herself because he is taking the flowers to visit his mother's grave. Also, Jack is no fool, and he was aware that she was following him the entire time. We discover that Jack's mother died when she was tragically young, when she was only 30, and Jack only 9. Sadly, she perished in the Peshtigo fire of 1871. However, this occurred the same day as the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, so no one recalls it. And I myself, as I've said plenty of times, I'm a huge history buff, so I know about the Great Chicago Fire, but I have to be honest, I had never heard of the Peshtigo Fire. I wasn't even familiar with Peshtigo as a city. I didn't know it was located in Wisconsin, and neither had Bridget. Basically, his mother went to visit his aunt and her new baby. A forest fire swept into town, and you can imagine the rest. Over 2,000 people lost their lives, and worse, most of them couldn't even be identified, which means his mother's grave is just filled with some of her clothes and rocks for weight. Jack recalls how often his father would come to this grave to sit and think about his mother and reflect. But sadly, even his father passed away 5 months after his mother did. So now he visits every week during the month of his mother's birthday. So it's very clear that Jack has been subjected to untold tragedy, which, ironically, is something that Bridget also has in common with him. I have a feeling that this is really going to break new ground in their relationship. Back in Newport, Mrs. Fish attempts to put Bertha on total blast at the dinner table in front of the guests once she hears of Bertha's good news. Could this have something to do with her husband getting off? But once again, Bertha navigates the situation perfectly. And she says that he just wanted to let her know how well things are going and sending best wishes to everyone there. Mrs. Fish then informs Mr. McAllister that Bertha is clearly tenacious, which Bertha chooses to take as a thinly veiled compliment, considering all the time she pretended Bertha didn't exist. This is progress. We also see John and Gladys having a conversation, and it looks like Gladys is having a ball. And I was loving it. I was like, I promise you, if this man scoops Gladys from under Oscar's nose, I will scream. I will scream. Okay? And honestly, I'm not mad at it. Another L for Oscar.
Loser!
We also see a very interesting conversation with Carrie and the enigmatic Mrs. Astor. Carrie doesn't understand what the big deal is about accepting Bertha. What about Mrs. Ogden Mills? You have no problem entertaining her. She says that Mrs. Mills was born in Livingston, that her family have been landowners for 2 centuries or more, and that it's not her fault that she married an upstart. Besides, her mother asked Mrs. Astor not to punish her for it, and she won't. But as far as Mrs. Russell, she comes from nothing, and her husband is no better. Carrie feels she's simply being unkind. But as far as Mrs. Astor is concerned, to be a leader means sometimes one must be unkind. It is not a role for the faint-hearted. Back at the Van Ryn household, all is finally revealed to Agnes, with Marion, Ada, Armstrong, and Peggy in the same room. Agnes confesses that she was led to believe something very different about Peggy's story, that she had given birth to an illegitimate child and simply abandoned it. Gee, I wonder who's responsible for that spin on the story. Agnes says, as someone who has lost children, she can absolutely empathize. Ada starts to say something about that, but then Agnes interrupts her. I thought that was interesting. And ultimately, Peggy is grateful to Agnes and Ada, but she realizes she can no longer stay. Ada figures it would have been easier just to fire Armstrong, partly because she can't stand her. But Agnes already knows, trying to train a new maid in all my ways at this point in my life, it ain't happening. And in a scene that made my chest kind of tight, Agnes personally sees Peggy off. She tells her that she's an ambitious young woman and that not everyone will support that, but that she also has more than enough strength to manage it all. And lastly, she shakes her hand and tells her, God bless you. And as Peggy leaves, you can see the sadness very evident in both their eyes. I love that in spite of the circumstances, in spite of the differences, like that there was some sort of kinship there, a very unlikely kinship, like I said, but man, I was here for the dynamics, so I'm not gonna lie, I was like, oh man, come on, you're killing me right now, you're killing me. Back in Newport, we see Bertha and Gladys at Mr. and Mrs. McAllister's home. They're having a discussion about the building of Mrs. Astor's home in Newport, called Beechwood, for $200,000. Which would equate to about $5.5 million today. Quite the pretty penny. It's clear that Bertha has her own interest in building something similar, and she would have liked to have seen the inside of the home for herself. Well, leave it to Mr. McAllister. He figures since she's out of town and won't be arriving until the next day, he'll just go and take her to see it himself. It also helps that he has a very good rapport with her butler, Mr. Hefty. And he does exactly that, and as you can imagine, it is quite the stately home. And as I also suspected, everything is quickly cut short when Mrs. Astor arrives at the home way ahead of schedule, which means that Bertha is led on a wild goose chase out of the house, through the servants' quarters, through the kitchen, and finally out into the backyard. But judging from the look on Bertha's face, and if the feathers flying around her face are any indication, her goose isn't cooked quite yet. And that closes out episode 8, Tucked Up in Newport. Whew, now this was an episode. We saw a lot of reveals. We learned a whole lot about different characters. We saw some dynamics shift. Like, there was a lot going on in that ending. I was not prepared for that ending. That outfit she had on, it was definitely giving me Foghorn Leghorn.
You know what the back's for? No, boy. You're supposed to hit the ball with it. The ball!
But I am really intrigued to know, like, how this show is going to end. We have 1 episode left. Like, I cannot believe. It really feels like the season flew by, even though it was weekly. It's just like, it's hard to believe that we're already at the end. And as always, please feel free to let me know your thoughts on this episode. Please tell me how you felt about George and his legal case and that whole twist with Miss Ainsley. How do you feel about Oscar and John basically getting his revenge? How do you feel about Tom and Marion's foolery once again? And how do you feel about Peggy now that you have learned her story? Is that what you thought it would be? Did you think it would be something else? And do you think there still might be more to that? Especially regarding this midwife that's missing. And also, please let me know your predictions for the finale. Like, what do you think is going to go down? What are our cliffhangers going to be? Like, what do you think we're going to see? I am very intrigued to know. So please, feel free to leave your thoughts down below. So, once again, this is D, Movie Man, signing off. And I'll see you with the movies.